Yeah, I remember I was flew into Islamabad, Pakistan, and hopped into a taxi, and the driver said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "The U.S." And he just said, "Ah, superpower." And it was sort of just one word said it all. And I'm wondering, is the U.S. the only superpower, or when it comes to the competition of ideas, or these days do we face competition out there for hearts and minds from China and from the likes of Hugo Chavez? China is spending lots of money in Africa. Speaking of Africa, they're buying up oil from Sudan. Hugo Chavez has his daily presidential show and throws around money as well. I mean, should we see this as a competition for hearts and minds that with some smaller competitors, China being smaller for the time being, and Venezuela, or is that just Cold War thinking? Anybody?
Oh, we are not just competitive. We sort of want to be the whole thing, and when other people do things like what China is doing, somehow it's bad. I mean, we own oil wells and have companies operating all over the world. China's a growing, powerful country. You can't stop it. And so you've got to sort of find a way, probably if you're really deaf, to join with them to do these things. But if you see other countries growing in power and decided they're the enemy, then you're going to oppose them. And it's a big world, and there are a lot of problems, and we ought to spend a lot of time trying jointly to deal with them. You have other agencies. I mean, you've got an intelligence agent, you've got a Defense Department. Let them worry about the question of how powerful countries are getting and how they're operating. But to sit around and try to oppose a country like China or India or the rest of them because you don't want them to grow is mindless. It is a small world. And the other thing we should have learned by what's going on in Iraq is that a monstrous standing armies and missiles that can go anywhere within an hour are not as useful as they used to be and shouldn't be.
Speaking of China, one of the interesting items out of the Pew study was that anti-Chinese feeling is also on the increase around the world. So probably the best evidence yet that China's on the rise is that people are starting to hate them too. So I think your theory might be right that if you're number one, you're hated.
But I was just going to say, I don't think the Chinese are selling an idea or a vision. I think they're cornering the market on commodities. I don't think there's anybody that is in danger of becoming a great admirer of the Chinese system per se. I don't
They're
think
there for the oil.
Yeah, and that's. But I think that's quite different from the Islamic world where there is a battle of ideas, and I guess to some extent in Latin America, I think that's true. I think China, to me, is in a different category.
Some dictators think the Chinese. Some people think that there is an aggressive, successful form of autocracy being born, of which China and Russia would be examples. It helps if you've got a lot of oil or people or natural resources. I was at a conference which lends into a lot of these issues of big foreign policy experts, and there were two papers that really struck me as touching on a lot of these subjects. The first was by a guy named John Eikenberry at Princeton, who said we no longer face one central threat. We face a milieu of threats. Most of them are not traditional foreign policy threats. They're global warming, they're global hunger, they're global disease, they're non-proliferation. And what we need to do is create a series of multinational organizations which can deal with these milieu of threats. And it strikes me as that when you listen to a lot of the Democratic presidential candidates, they say a version of that. Another person at the conference was a guy named Robert Kagan, who's now at the Carnegie Endowment, who said, no, we're still in the same old world we've been in, which is a world of nation-state rivalries. And that there's China, there's India, there's Iran, and that we're the top, we're the most powerful, but then there are a whole series of regional powers. And one of the roles we're going to have to face in the coming years is making China's neighbors feel comfortable and secure that China won't take them over, Russia's neighbors comfortable and secure, Iran's neighbors comfortable and secure. And that will improve our own standing by constraining the other dominant bullies. And so those are two rival ways of seeing the world. And I think it breaks down, if you look at the presidential race, the mindset, and I don't think the candidates are even aware of most of their foreign policy views because it's in the substratum of assumptions. But I do think that breaks down into the two different parties' views of the world, at least reflected in their debates.
And if I could press you, but which view do you buy into, or is it a combination?
I buy into both. I think the Kagan view vastly understates the amount of non-nation state problems we're about to face, whether it is non-proliferation, global disease, global warming, and all that stuff. I think the Eikenberry view vastly underestimates the amount of national differences in worldview that's going to prevent us from creating global organizations. In other words, I think it's going to be hard to create a global social service sector because we see things so differently from the French, from the Chinese, from the Russians, et cetera, et cetera. So we're caught in this middle ground with non-nation state problems, but without non-nation state institutions to solve them.
Speaking of multinational organizations, do you see the United Nations making a comeback in the next 8 years, say, or has it seen its heyday as an effective international body? Jerry? We could talk for 2 hours about that. But
yeah, exactly. I guess if you were going to look at a trend line to answer that question, you would have to say that the Bush administration has become much more enamored of the United Nations as a useful tool in the last 3 or 4 years than it was in the previous 3 or 4 years. So I suppose by that standard, it's already making a comeback. And I suspect you'll see more of it. I guess my view of the UN is it comes and it goes, and it'll always be of use, but probably of limited use. It'll be used more by a Democratic administration relatively than by a Republican administration. And I suppose that right now, the idea that, yeah, you can actually do something good using the UN for certain problems is certainly on the uptick in intellectual circles around this town, but I also think there's limits to that.
Okay. We're going to take some questions from the audience about anything along the lines of what we've talked about. We haven't talked too much about the presidential election yet. Some questions along those lines would be good, but any questions will be entertained. I think we have microphones on either side, there and there. If you could walk up to a microphone and tell us who you are, and you can address the question to one of the panelists or in general, and I'll funnel it to somebody.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill O'Keefe. I'm with the Catholic Relief Services. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to take a stab at comparing and contrasting some of the individual candidates and what they've said so far, what they haven't said so far about these issues of global poverty in the campaign. Thank you.
Okay. And just touches on the question of whether this presidential campaign is going to be all about Iraq, 24/7, as they say, or we can get the candidates to talk about something more than Iraq. Anyone want to take that question?
No? Okay. Well, I mean, it does strike me that the whole debate is, and this I think is a real danger, that it's been pretty well stunted by Iraq so far. I mean, there is in fact a lot more to talk about, but I don't think it's been talked about a whole lot. And I don't see a lot of substance on these particular issues in the campaign, but maybe I'm not paying enough attention. I think it's coming. I think there are a range of issues that need and will be discussed once people can stop. If everybody exhausts themselves on Iraq, this is one of them. Global development and the battle of ideas. I think the rise of protectionism and nationalism in reaction to Iraq and to the global economy is a big issue. I think China, can't be avoided, and I think there's an Iran issue separate from the Iraq issue that needs to be addressed. And I think they're all out there. My sense of it is that none of them are really fully engaged yet, but maybe that's not fair to the candidates.
I think that's largely true, especially on global poverty. I guess the one thing I'd say is that one of the things that strikes me, and this is a lesson from the Bush administration, it's less important to pay attention to where the candidates are on a left-to-right axis than the frame of their mind.